Hello, friends. So today we're lecturing, or we're talking about two claims from Hume, right? David Hume. So just a little bit of quick background. David Hume is an 18th century Scottish philosopher. He's part of what's often called the Scottish Enlightenment, right? Where you get folks like David Hume in philosophy and Adam Smith in economics. Um, you get the sort of upsurge of activity, of intellectual or sort of academic activity out of Scotland. So Hume is what's often called, well, Hume is an empiricist philosopher. So what does that mean? Well, we contrast Hume with Descartes, right? So the easiest way to get at how Hume does philosophy is to think first about how Descartes does philosophy. So Descartes, as you'll recall, relies on things like introspection, right, sort of thinking about his own thinking, and on thought experiments to make his point. So again, think back to his argument that we can't know anything for certain about the external world. Perhaps there's this thing, the evil demon, and the evil demon is deceiving us all the time. And because this is conceivable, it's possible, and because it's possible, that undercuts all of our knowledge about the external world. For Hume, he doesn't want to rely on the kinds of arguments, the sort of argument style that Descartes relies on. So he's sort of marginally interested in thought experiments. What he's much more interested in is observation, right? Knowledge through observation. And we get that here, right? We get that in full force in the piece where he's talking about the self. So Hume's two claims that we're going to look at today are, first, that there's no such thing as a cohesive or sort of a core self. Second, that we aren't rational, but rather we're emotional organisms, right? That when we act, we don't act on the basis of reason, or rather that reason doesn't power our activities, rather it's emotion that powers our activities. So let's deal with the claim about the self first. So Hume's position about the self takes aim at the claim from the package deal that we have these disembodied minds, right? So we saw at the beginning of this week, we saw Ryle and Strawson challenging the disembodied part. We saw Churchland challenging the mind part, and now we have Hume likewise challenging the mind part, right? He says there's no such thing as the self, right? There's no sort of core to us. How does he get there? Well, the argument is actually kind of straightforward. So again, remember, for Hume, we know things only through observation. So let's think about ourselves for a moment. When we think about ourselves, what exactly are we remembering, right? What exactly are we thinking about? So here's me, right? So let me think about what I had for breakfast, right? So this morning for breakfast, I had some toast, and I had a banana, and I had a bunch of coffee. Let me think about myself a little more. It's one of my favorite pastimes. What are some of the things that I like? Well, I like to bake bread. I like to watch some TV. I like to occasionally go run. So I come up with features. I describe things that I like, right? So if somebody asked me to describe myself, what might I say? Well, I'd say that I research philosophy, that I teach philosophy. I'd say that oftentimes I'm more or less patient. I'd say that I have a quirky sense of humor. So when I'm talking about myself, I describe features of my past, right? I describe things I've done. I describe things I like. I describe things I don't like. I describe features of my personality. I describe various social roles that I have, and so on, right? This is what we do when we talk about ourselves. But Hume says, so Hume's challenge to us is this. He says, when you're thinking about yourself, pay close attention to the things that come to mind. or the things that you see when you introspect. So when you think about yourself, what do you see, right? What comes to mind? Do you see like a little self, or are you simply remembering past perceptions? So let's go with the example of eating breakfast. So this morning, right, so I say to myself, this morning I ate toast and a banana and I drank some coffee. So when I'm remembering that, I'm remembering the sensation of eating toast, right, and the sensation of eating banana and of tasting coffee. And if I say to myself, well, no, right, I see myself in my mind's eye sitting down at the breakfast table, or rather standing at the kitchen counter, drinking my coffee, eating my toast, eating my banana. When I'm doing that, what's going on is I'm, in a sense, mentally, visually perceiving myself doing certain things. So we ask the question, are you perceiving a self there? And for Hume, the answer is no, right? I'm having perceptions. I'm having a perception of me as I was in the past, or I'm having a perception of, I'm remembering tasting the coffee or the banana, but I'm not getting a glimpse at something like a soul, right? Or when I think about my personality, right? I say things like, right? I think about, I have a quirky sense of humor, I might say. Am I catching a glimpse of my soul there? Well, no, right? When I say I have a quirky sense of humor, I'm thinking about things that make me feel a certain way, right? I'm thinking about jokes that I find funny. I'm thinking about jokes I don't find funny. I think about jokes I tell. But I'm not catching a glimpse of my soul in any of that. For Hume, whenever we think about ourselves, what we're thinking about are past perceptions, right? We're remembering past experiences. We're remembering past perceptions. But we're never catching a glimpse of our soul in any of this. So then he asks the question, well, if we never actually see our souls, if we never experience our souls, then why believe that we have them? And his answer is, well, we shouldn't, right? Because we never perceive a soul, right? And it's not even like I'm looking for a soul in my brain, right? Churchland, right? So think about this. Churchland would say, why do we disbelieve the idea of soul? Because we crack open our noggins and we never see any soul floating about in there, right? We see neurons, we see sodium ion channels, but we never see soul bits floating about in there. Hume says, well, you don't even have to crack open your soul. Just think about yourself for a minute, right? Do you ever perceive your soul in thinking about yourself? And the answer is no, right? We remember past experiences, but we don't remember a soul, right? The target of memory isn't a soul. It's past experiences, or what he calls past perceptions. So what is it that makes me, me? Hume's answer is nothing other than bundles of perceptions. So I am nothing more than collections of experiences, right? This is sometimes called the bundle theory of the self, right? But to call it a self is a bit misleading because there's nothing like a self responding to the way we typically think about a self, which is like a soul or a sort of a solitary soul or a mind stuff, right? What we're left with is we're left with collections of experiences that just hang together, right? So here's an analogy, right? So you've got an orange, you've got the orange peel, right? So it'd be orange and orange peel, right? So for Descartes, what holds the orange peel together is the orange, right? The flesh of the orange, right? And that flesh of the orange is like a soul, right? The soul holds all of our experiences together, right? So the experiences kind of cling to the soul like an orange peel clings to the flesh of the orange. For Hume, when we peel away the orange peel, there's nothing there, right? There is no flesh of the orange. We simply have experiences. There's nothing underneath those experiences holding them all together, right? You are nothing but bundles of experience. if I could somehow pull out all of your experiences, there'd be nothing of you left, right? There would literally be no you. So a good question that Hume asks is, if that's the case, how have we been deceived for so long, right? How have we managed to fool ourselves for so long that there's something like a soul, right? Why didn't really smart people see this before? Well, the answer is largely because we don't often notice small change. Well, actually, there are two parts to the answer, right? Sorry, I cut myself off there. Damn me. There are two parts to the answer. The first one is we don't often notice small changes, right? I mean, think about so think about when you scrub a kitchen floor. So when you scrub the kitchen floor, right? It's nice, it's shiny, it's new. You yell at your kids when they come in with muddy shoes, or you get mad at your pets for tracking in dirt and dead animals and whatnot, right? But gradually, over time, the floor gets dirtier and dirtier and dirtier until eventually, like a month later, you've got to scrub it again, or 2 months later, you got to scrub it again. But that change from clean to dirty was a very gradual one. You didn't notice it, right? Each little step brought you further away from the clean floor, right? But it's not like at any particular day we notice the floor getting dirtier. It just gets dirtier. But nonetheless, right? That's the key. The key is that even though we don't notice the change in the cleanliness of the floor, the change is still there, right? It's different from what it was before, right? The state of cleanliness of the floor is different from what it was the day before. And the same thing goes for, well, everything. And for us in particular, we don't notice small changes to ourselves, but those changes are happening nonetheless. And so we become different, but we don't sort of see that it's happening. But that doesn't change the fact that it is happening. So that's the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is that we have a tendency, when we don't see these major changes, to presume that things stay the same over time. Right? Why do we do this? Well, it's just sort of a mental habit we've gotten ourselves into. Right? So I've got my phone here. Right? My phone changes over time. But it's just sort of a habit for me to think of my phone as the same today as it was yesterday. Right? Because I see it, right? I have one impression after another, after another, after another, and I think of the object as persisting through all of these perceptions, right? And again, why do I do that? Well, just because it's, frankly, just kind of convenient for me to do that. I mean, imagine if I had to think of this as a brand new object every time I looked at it, right? It'd be like, holy crap, what the hell is this thing, right? And we don't do that. It would be bad for us if we did that. So we've just gotten into a habit of thinking of things as very, very similar to one another through time, as being the same object throughout time. But it's not, right? It's changing constantly, just like us, right? And we too are constantly changing. So how do we fool ourselves into thinking there was a soul when there wasn't? Well, because we perceive ourselves as being the same throughout time. And so we, in a sense, got into a habit of thinking ourselves as unchanging throughout time. But the truth of it is that when you try to mentally see that, when you think about yourself, all you catch are experiences. All you perceive are past experiences. We never perceive a self through introspection, through thinking about ourselves, right? We only perceive past experiences. So that's the first part of Hume's position that we're talking about today. That there is no, that we challenge the first element of the package view, that there's a disembodied mind, because, well, there is no sort of single coherent mind to speak of, right? There is no soul, there's no self, right? There's simply bundles of experience, right? We are naught but bundles of experience. Now, the second part that Hume challenges is the idea that we are rational. So how does he get to this? Well, he starts with a very familiar dichotomy. He says that we're either driven by reason or we're driven by passion. Now, ordinarily, we call this emotion, right? We say that you have to be that we are emotional beings or we're rational beings. He uses the broader term of passion. But what passion includes is it includes emotion, but it also includes appetites or desires. So we have reason on the one hand, and we have emotions and desires on the other, or passions. So, we are driven either by reason or by our passions. And he says, we're not driven by reason, right? Therefore, he concludes, we're driven by passion. So you'll recognize this from your critical thinking days as being a disjunctive syllogism, right? Either A or B. It's not A, therefore it must be B. So the key argument here is to show that we are not governed by reason, that our actions are not driven by reason. So how does he get here? Well, he thinks about the things that we think about. So what are the things that we think about? Well, Hume says they fall into two categories. The first one is what he calls, abstract objects. So what are abstract objects? Well, these are objects that we acknowledge exist, but don't exist sort of in our concrete lives. So the paradigm example of an abstract object is number. So let's think about reasoning involving numbers. So examples of this, clearly, there are plenty, right? Like when we do math problems, like when you sit down to do your math homework, or when you're at the grocery store and you're trying to figure out if you have enough cash in your pocket to buy whatever, or when you are trying to see if you can figure out, how big a mortgage you need to take out, or when you're trying to figure out, the credit card with the best with the best interest rate. We do problems with numbers all the time, right? But numbers are numbers are abstract objects, right? What's a concrete object? My pen, my phone, my papers, this phone, right? Those are all concrete objects. Numbers are abstract objects. I can't touch a number. I can't, swat a number around. So, what are we doing when we're thinking about abstract objects? Well, we're working with numbers. We're comparing numbers, right? We might say that one big number is bigger than another. We might say that two numbers, when you add them, are equivalent to this other number. Stuff like that. So let's imagine a concrete situation. Imagine you go to the store, right? Imagine you've got 20 bucks in your pocket. And suppose you want to buy a lamp, and this lamp costs $15. Well, what do you know? Well, if we're thinking about numbers, I know that the number of dollars in my pocket, or the value of dollars in my pocket, is greater than the value of the lamp. I know I have enough money to buy the lamp, but just knowing that there's enough, that the number of dollars in my pocket is greater than the number of dollars it takes to buy the lamp doesn't tell me that I should buy the lamp, right? It doesn't propel me or motivate me to buy the lamp, right? All it tells me is that I have more dollars in my pocket than it takes to buy the lamp. So, thinking involving abstract objects doesn't propel us to act. It doesn't motivate us to act. So now let's go with the other case. The other case is when we think about concrete objects, or what Hume calls objects of our experience. And what he says is, even then, simply knowing about concrete objects, that doesn't tell us, or that doesn't propel us to act. That doesn't compel us to act in any particular way. So, how do we get to this conclusion? Let's think of a case, right? So, I know that a hot stove will burn my hand. How do I know this? Well, because, I sometimes do dumb things, like put my hand on a hot stove, or I pick up a hot pan. So when I pick up a hot pan, or when I put my hand on a hot stove, what do I know? Well, I know that the stove is causing burning sensations in me, right? It's causing painful experiences in me, right? I know that doing this to a hot stove causes, or is positively correlated with, is the way Hume would want to say, is positively correlated with experience with painful sensations, right? With experiences of pain. Does that tell me not to put my hand on the stove? And the answer clearly is no. What putting my hand on the hot stove tells me is that if I put my hand on the hot stove, then I'll experience pain. But that doesn't tell me that I shouldn't put my hand on the hot stove. What it tells me is, if I put my hand on the stove, then I'm going to experience pain. So, what would tell me, don't put your hand on the stove? Well, it's almost embarrassingly simple. It's my desire not to experience pain. I don't put my hand on a stove because I don't want to be burned. All there is to it. But notice, right? Notice the implication of this embarrassingly simple point. I act because of my desires, or because of my passions, is a broader way of putting it. I don't act because of reason, right? I don't act because of knowledge I have of the world. I do things primarily because of my desires, or because of my emotions, right? I might shout at somebody because I'm angry. I don't shout at somebody because some reasoning process tells me to shout at somebody. So, again, recapping the argument, my actions are motivated, they're compelled either by reason or by passion. They're not compelled by reason, because reason can be reasoning in two ways, either involving abstract objects or involving concrete objects or concrete experiences. It can't be abstract objects, because abstract objects simply tell me reasoning about abstract objects tells me interesting relationships among abstract objects, but it doesn't tell me what to do, it doesn't compel me to act in any way. Reasoning about concrete experiences and concrete objects tells me interesting relationships among those concrete objects, but it doesn't tell me to do anything, right? So, can't be reason, therefore it must be passion. So we act because of our emotions and because of our desires. And Hume has a really provocative line at the end of this reading, at the end of this particular reading. He says, reason is and ought to be a slave to the passions. So again, reason is and ought to be a slave of the passions. Why is this? Or rather, how does he get here? Well, think about what reason does for us. Reason tells us about relationships among abstract objects, like numbers. Reason tells us about how the world works, right? It tells me if I put my hand on a stove, on a hot stove, then I'll experience pain. But reason doesn't tell me to do something, right? Reason doesn't propel me to act. It only tells me how to accomplish my ends, right? Emotions and desires, right? Those are what prompt me to act. So what reason tells me is it tells me how to accomplish certain ends, right? It tells me how to make my way in the world. But what actually gets me going is desire. What actually gets me going are my emotions. So the conclusion for Hume is that we aren't primarily rational creatures. It's not that there's no such thing as reason at all, right? Like Churchland might say. But rather, that the sole function of reason is to tell us how the world works so that we can act in it. But what propels us to act, what really motivates us, is emotion. So reason is the slave of desire. Reason is the slave of emotion. And so what's in the driver's seat, what actually gets us going, what motivates us to act, are our desires and our emotions. We aren't rational creatures the way that Descartes says we are, according to Hume. Rather, we are primarily emotional, and appetitive creatures. We are creatures of desires. We are creatures of emotions. And reason simply tells us how to get the things that we desire.